Riverside Police Department falls into stunned silence as U.S. Army Colonel Simone Mitchell enters in full-dress uniform, her chest decorated with Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and combat medals, while multiple officers face immediate arrest for the degrading assault they committed just 8 hours earlier. Officer Craig Brennan's confident authority crumbles as he recognizes the black woman whose hair he and his fellow officers had forcibly shaved in the detention cell. The same woman he'd dismissed as another troublemaker who needs to be taught respect. "Good afternoon, Officer Brennan," Colonel Mitchell announces, her voice carrying unmistakable military authority throughout the packed police station. "I am Colonel Simone Mitchell, United States Army, decorated combat veteran with 3 combat tours. Some of you may recognize me as the woman you stripped of dignity by forcibly shaving my hair while I was in your custody." Her eyes lock onto Brennan, who has gone pale. "Officer Brennan, I believe we need to discuss why you and 3 other officers committed degrading treatment against a senior military officer, and why you told me that women like you need to learn what happens when you disrespect authority." The gathered officers freeze in recognition. The sergeant who 8 hours ago had wielded absolute power now faces the decorated colonel whose military authority will ensure comprehensive accountability. And federal charges are already filed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 18 hours earlier, Colonel Simone Mitchell had been driving home from Fort Davidson Army Base after completing critical intelligence briefings, her 23-year military career having taken her from enlisted soldier to distinguished field-grade officer commanding respect throughout the Department of Defense. At 45, Mitchell had built her reputation through exceptional leadership during 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Her intelligence analysis work credited with saving countless American lives, while her command abilities earned her rapid promotion through competitive officer ranks. Her natural hair, worn in carefully maintained locks that complied with updated Army grooming regulations, explicitly permitting traditional black hairstyles, represented both cultural identity and professional pride in service that honored her whole self rather than demanding assimilation. The Army's 2021 grooming policy updates had finally acknowledged that previous regulations requiring hairstyles conforming to Eurocentric standards had discriminated against black service members, particularly women whose natural hair textures required different maintenance approaches. Mitchell's locks had been grown over 7 years, their length and styling representing personal expression within military regulations that now recognize diverse cultural traditions rather than enforcing assimilationist standards that had historically marginalized minority service members. Her drive home that evening had been routine until she was stopped by Riverside Police for alleged traffic violation that would prove to be pretextual justification for the systematic abuse that followed. Officer Craig Brennan had initiated the traffic stop, claiming Mitchell's vehicle had expired registration, despite valid tags clearly visible on her license plate and military-based decal indicating active duty status. At 42, Brennan had served with Riverside PD for 16 years. His personnel file, documenting pattern of aggressive enforcement, particularly targeting minority motorists who experienced traffic stops at rates significantly exceeding their demographic representation. His approach to policing reflected personal racial bias disguised as aggressive enforcement, his interactions with black residents consistently demonstrating hostility and assumption of criminality that white motorists rarely encountered during similar traffic stops. Internal Affairs investigations had reviewed multiple excessive force complaints against Brennan without implementing meaningful discipline. The department's culture protecting officers through administrative processes that prioritized institutional loyalty over constitutional accountability. Police Chief Ronald Armstrong had been managing community relations challenges while facing officer union resistance to reforms that might increase accountability or limit discretion, enabling discriminatory practices that federal oversight was designed to prevent. Individual officers exercise professional judgment during enforcement activities, Armstrong had explained during community forums that failed to address systematic patterns affecting minority residents who experienced disproportionate police contact. The institutional tolerance for Brennan's discrimination had enabled escalating abuse while creating an environment where minority residents feared police interactions that should have provided public safety rather than representing threat to constitutional rights. Mitchell's military training had prepared her for combat operations in hostile territory, but nothing in her service had anticipated the degrading abuse she would experience from American law enforcement officers in her own community. The traffic stop had occurred at 7:30 p.m. in well-lit commercial area. Mitchell's professional demeanor and military courtesy immediately evident as she provided license, registration, and military identification, documenting her status as active duty Army. "Colonel, ma'am, I'm Colonel Simone Mitchell, U.S. Army," she had stated clearly. "My registration is current, and I'm returning home from Fort Davidson. Is there a specific concern about my vehicle or driving?" Her professional military bearing should have prompted courteous resolution, but Brennan's response had revealed predetermined hostility. "Military ID doesn't exempt you from civilian law enforcement. Step out of the vehicle for field sobriety evaluation." The demand for sobriety testing, despite no indicators of impairment, violated constitutional protections while demonstrating discriminatory treatment that military status hadn't prevented. Despite Mitchell's expectation that professional courtesy between law enforcement and military would ensure respectful interaction, Mitchell had complied with all lawful orders while documenting constitutional violations through calm, measured responses that her military training had ingrained. "Officer, I haven't been drinking. I'm willing to cooperate with legitimate law enforcement, but I'd like to understand the basis for sobriety testing." A reasonable question had been interpreted as challenge rather than appropriate assertion of constitutional rights. Brennan's escalating aggression, revealing that her military rank and professional demeanor were being ignored in favor of racial bias. Additional officers had arrived as backup, their presence transforming routine traffic stop into intimidating show of force disproportionate to any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Officer Todd Fisher and Officer Brian Wallace had joined Brennan, their coordinated approach suggesting familiarity with escalation tactics that transformed minor stops into arrests, justifying further abuse. What Mitchell couldn't have known was that her calm professionalism and military bearing, rather than protecting her from abuse, would trigger Brennan's hostility toward educated, accomplished black women whose success challenged his racial prejudices. The fabricated sobriety test results, despite Mitchell's clear sobriety, had provided pretextual justification for arrest that would allow the systematic degradation that Brennan and his colleagues had planned. As Mitchell was handcuffed and transported to police station on false charges that would later be dismissed, she had no way of anticipating that her military service and constitutional rights would be systematically violated through degrading abuse specifically designed to humiliate and dehumanize her. The decorated combat veteran, who had served her country with distinction, was about to experience the same systematic racism that her military career had been partially designed to rise above through professional excellence and unwavering service. Colonel Simone Mitchell was processed into Riverside Police Department detention on fabricated charges of DUI and resisting arrest. the false accusations providing administrative justification for custody that would enable the degrading abuse officers had already decided to inflict. The booking process had been deliberately humiliating from the start, officers treating decorated military officer with contempt that her rank and service should have prevented even within civilian law enforcement context. "Empty your pockets and remove all jewelry," Officer Fisher had commanded, without the professional courtesy typically extended to military personnel. His hostile tone, suggesting Mitchell's uniform and rank, meant nothing to officers who saw only her race. Mitchell had complied while maintaining military bearing, despite growing recognition that constitutional violations were escalating beyond routine harassment. "Officers, I'm active duty Army Colonel. My command will be notified of my detention, and I request immediate contact with military legal counsel." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The denial of military notification rights violated Department of Defense agreements with civilian law enforcement, requiring coordination when active duty personnel were detained. But institutional culture at Riverside PD prioritized officer authority over constitutional and regulatory compliance. Mitchell was placed in holding cell where Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Sergeant Dennis Shaw gathered with obvious hostile intent that exceeded routine detention procedures. "You think your military rank makes you special?" Brennan stated with unmistakable contempt. "You think those locks make you look professional in uniform? We're going to teach you about respect and appropriate appearance." The specific reference to her natural hair revealed that the planned abuse targeted both her racial identity and her professional military appearance. That complied with current Army regulations. Mitchell's military training had prepared her for resistance to interrogation and prisoner abuse scenarios, but nothing had anticipated systematic degradation by American law enforcement. "Officers, my hair complies with Army grooming regulations. Whatever you're planning constitutes assault and violation of my constitutional rights." Her clear assertion of legal protections was ignored as 4 officers entered the cell with obvious intent to commit physical abuse. "You don't have rights here. You have whatever we decide to give you." The explicit denial of constitutional protections revealed systematic abuse of authority that would later constitute federal civil rights violations. In criminal assault charges, Brennan produced electric clippers while other officers physically restrained Mitchell, their coordinated actions demonstrating premeditated plan rather than spontaneous misconduct. "Officers, what you're planning is assault and battery," Mitchell stated with military command voice, despite her restrained position. "I'm ordering you to stop this immediately and contact my commanding officer at Fort Davidson. Her military authority, even while detained, should have prompted reconsideration." But the officer's laughter revealed complete disregard for both her rank and her rights. "You're not giving orders here, Colonel," Brennan mocked while activating the clippers. "You're about to learn what happens to people who think they're better than us." The explicit acknowledgement of Mitchell's rank while proceeding with abuse demonstrated that officers were fully aware they were degrading military officer. Their actions motivated by racial hatred rather than any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Mitchell struggled against the restraints while clearly articulating her non-consent. "This is assault. I do not consent to any alteration of my appearance. You are violating federal law and military regulations." Her verbal protests were designed to create clear record that abuse was non-consensual. Her military intelligence training ensuring that she documented violations even while experiencing them. The officers forcibly shaved Mitchell's head completely, removing 7 years of carefully maintained locks while she was physically restrained and verbally protesting. The degrading abuse captured on detention cell cameras that officers either forgot about or believed their institutional protection would prevent from being used against Them. Now you look like you belong in a cell, Brennan stated while collecting Mitchell's shorn locks as grotesque trophy. Maybe you'll remember this the next time you think you're military. Rank means anything to us. The explicit statement connecting the abuse to her military status would later constitute crucial evidence that assault was motivated by bias against both her race and her service. Mitchell, despite her shock and trauma, began mental documentation process that intelligence training had ingrained, identifying all participants, noting exact statements, cataloging constitutional violations, and planning the comprehensive federal response that her military position would enable. Officers Brennan, Vischer Wallace, and Sergeant Shaw, she stated clearly for the camera she assumed was recording, "You have just committed assault and battery, civil rights violations, and abuse under color of law against active duty U.S. Army Colonel. Federal and military authorities will be notified immediately upon my release." Her calm military bearing, despite degrading abuse, provided sharp contrast to officers' aggressive misconduct. The video record documenting both their violence and her professional composure under systematic attack. As the officers left her in the cell, Mitchell began the psychological compartmentalization that combat veterans learn, processing trauma while maintaining operational focus on the accountability mission that would transform this degrading abuse into comprehensive federal prosecution. The degrading abuse against Colonel Simone Mitchell escalated beyond the forced head-shaving as officers attempted to further humiliate her through systematic violations designed to break her military bearing and documented composure. Mitchell sat in the detention cell with her head completely shaved, the physical assault compounded by psychological trauma of having 7 years of natural hair forcibly removed as punishment for imagined disrespect that existed only in officers' racist assumptions. Officer Brennan returned with camera phone, his obvious intent to photograph and mock Mitchell's appearance, representing continuation of systematic degradation. "Let's document your new look. Maybe we'll share it with your military friends so they can see what their fancy colonel really looks like." The threat to distribute humiliating photographs constituted additional abuse designed to extend trauma beyond the immediate assault through public humiliation and professional damage. Mitchell maintained military discipline despite trauma. Officer Brennan, photographing detained individuals for personal purposes, violates department policy and my privacy rights. Your continued abuse is being documented and will face comprehensive federal prosecution. Her calm legal analysis, while experiencing systematic degradation, demonstrated exceptional self-control that her military training had developed through years of high-stress command situations. Officer Fisher brought standard jail clothing. "Strip and change into detention uniform. Your military clothes don't mean anything." Here, the demand to remove her army uniform represented symbolic stripping of military identity and professional status that the abuse was designed to attack. "I'm entitled to wear my uniform unless there's legitimate security justification for requiring change," Mitchell stated, citing military regulations regarding treatment of service members in civilian custody. "Forcing me to remove my uniform constitutes additional degradation without legal basis." Her knowledge of military law demonstrated that despite the abuse, her professional expertise remained intact and would inform the comprehensive accountability response. Sergeant Shaw, who had supervised but not directly participated in the hair assault, attempted to justify the systematic abuse. "Colonel Mitchell, you were resisting booking procedures and creating security concerns. Officers used appropriate measures to establish order and compliance. The fabricated justification contradicted video evidence showing Mitchell's complete cooperation prior to the assault, his false statement constituting official misconduct that would support federal charges." Sergeant Shaw, "Detention cameras recorded my full cooperation prior to 4 officers forcibly shaving my head," Mitchell responded with prosecutorial precision. Your false statement adds obstruction of justice to the federal charges you're already facing. Her direct accusation of criminal conduct while still in custody demonstrated strategic thinking about building comprehensive case despite ongoing vulnerability. Officer Wallace attempted intimidation through threats about criminal charges. Colonel, you're facing serious DUI and resisting arrest charges. Your military career is over, and your rank won't protect you from civilian criminal prosecution. The threat was designed to create fear about professional consequences. But Mitchell's intelligence background had prepared her for psychological operations that the abuse represented. Officer Wallace, fabricated charges won't survive basic evidentiary review, Mitchell stated calmly. Breathalyzer results showing 0 blood alcohol, video evidence of my cooperation, and witness testimony will expose your false arrest. Focus your concern on the federal civil rights prosecution you're facing. Her confident legal analysis, despite her degraded condition, provided psychological counter to intimidation while documenting her awareness of strong legal position. Additional officers began gathering to observe the detained colonel, their curiosity about the military woman who thinks she's special, revealing institutional culture that enabled abuse through dehumanization. That's the colonel who got her head shaved, officers whispered. Brennan said she was disrespectful and needed to be taught a lesson about authority. The casual discussion of assault as teaching a lesson demonstrated systematic normalization of abuse within department culture that would require comprehensive federal intervention. Mitchell overheard the conversations while maintaining dignified silence, her intelligence training recognizing that gathering information about institutional culture would support systematic investigation beyond individual prosecution. Lieutenant Gerald Foster arrived to assess the situation after receiving unusual detention reports. What's the status on the military detainee? Why wasn't I notified about active duty officer in custody? His procedural concern suggested awareness that military detention required supervisory notification, but his delayed response indicated systematic failure of oversight protocols. Sergeant Shaw provided misleading briefing. Lieutenant, detainee became non-compliant during booking and required physical intervention to establish security. Standard detention procedures were followed. The false characterization of assault as standard detention procedures demonstrated systematic dishonesty that enabled abuse through administrative cover-up. Mitchell directly addressed the lieutenant. Lieutenant Foster, I'm Colonel Simone Mitchell, U.S. Army. 4 officers forcibly shaved my head without legal justification while I was physically restrained. Detention cameras recorded the assault. I'm requesting immediate contact with my commanding officer and military legal counsel. Her direct appeal to supervisory authority tested whether command structure would provide protection or enable continued abuse through institutional loyalty to subordinate officers. Foster's response would determine whether department leadership would address obvious constitutional violations or protect officers through administrative processes designed to prevent accountability. As tensions escalated and institutional responses revealed systematic protection of abusive officers, Mitchell recognized that her comprehensive federal response would need to address not just individual perpetrators, but the department culture that had enabled and protected their degrading abuse. While Colonel Simone Mitchell endured systematic degradation in Riverside Police Department detention, multiple parallel developments were creating comprehensive military and federal response that would transform routine police abuse into unprecedented accountability case requiring intervention at the highest levels of government. Fort Davidson Army Base had been alerted when Colonel Mitchell failed to report for scheduled morning intelligence briefing. her perfect attendance record triggering immediate concern from her command staff, who knew that unexplained absence suggested serious problem. Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, Mitchell's executive officer, initiated emergency contact protocols. Colonel Mitchell hasn't reported and isn't responding to communication. Her reliability means something serious has happened. Activate emergency response procedures. The military institutional response ensured rapid mobilization of resources that civilian victims of police abuse typically couldn't access through standard complaint procedures. Command Sergeant Major Raymond Scott contacted local law enforcement. Through military liaison protocols, we have missing Army colonel, last known traveling from Fort Davidson toward Riverside. Check detention records and traffic incident reports for Colonel Simone Mitchell. The military inquiry, through official channels, would soon reveal Mitchell's detention and trigger comprehensive institutional response. Commanding General Marcus Thompson was briefed during morning operational update about missing senior officer. Sir, Colonel Mitchell is unaccounted for. Last confirmed location was departing base yesterday evening. This is completely out of character for officer of her caliber. Thompson's immediate concern reflected both institutional responsibility for officer welfare and personal respect for Mitchell's distinguished service record. Meanwhile, Mitchell's daughter, Jasmine Richardson, had become concerned when her mother didn't respond to routine evening messages, the unusual silence prompting contact with military authorities. "My mom always texts me good night. She's Army colonel and extremely reliable. Something's wrong." Family concern added personal dimension to institutional military response, while ensuring civilian advocacy would complement military action. Department of Defense. Inspector General had been monitoring patterns of civilian law, enforcement abuse against service members, Mitchell's detention triggering automated alert, active duty colonel detained by civilian police without proper military notification, potential violation of DoD civilian law enforcement coordination agreements. Federal oversight systems were identifying institutional violations beyond individual abuse, ensuring comprehensive rather than isolated response. Military Police Colonel Patricia Hayes received emergency coordination request. Civilian police detained Army colonel overnight without military notification. This violates established protocols and suggests potential abuse requiring investigation. Military legal authority was mobilizing to ensure protection of service member rights that civilian detention had violated. Social media posts from Riverside. Residents who had witnessed Mitchell's traffic stop were beginning to circulate. Police pulled over black woman in nice car last night near downtown. Stop seemed aggressive and unjustified. Hope she's okay. Public documentation was creating additional evidence trail while building community awareness of potential misconduct. Civil rights organizations monitoring police abuse patterns identified Mitchell's detention through automated tracking. Riverside PD detained woman overnight on DUI charges, despite witness reports suggesting no impairment. Demographic patterns suggest potential racial profiling. Advocacy framework was preparing community response that would complement military and federal institutional action. Federal Bureau of Investigation Civil Rights Division maintained database. Tracking law enforcement abuse of military personnel, Mitchell's case flagged for potential investigation. Army colonel detained without proper military coordination. Pattern suggests potential civil rights violations requiring federal inquiry. Multiple federal oversight systems were independently identifying the case as requiring comprehensive investigation beyond local administrative review. Pentagon liaison. The Department of Justice had been briefed about missing colonel. Active duty 06 unaccounted for after civilian police contact. This requires immediate federal law enforcement coordination to ensure service member protection. Highest levels of military and federal government were being notified, ensuring that Mitchell's abuse would receive attention that typical victims couldn't access. Military justice attorneys were researching legal frameworks for addressing civilian law enforcement abuse of service members. Assault on active duty officer while in civilian custody creates complex jurisdictional issues. Federal prosecution, under civil rights statutes, provides strongest accountability mechanism. Legal strategy was developing that would ensure comprehensive prosecution, addressing both individual abuse and institutional failures. Congressional Armed Services Committee staff monitored reports of military personnel mistreatment. Army colonel detained by civilian police without proper notification. This incident may require congressional oversight of military-civilian law enforcement coordination. Legislative attention was ensuring political accountability beyond judicial and administrative mechanisms. Defense Secretary's office received briefing about missing colonel triggering concern about service member protection. Senior military officer unaccounted for raises questions about safety and proper treatment by civilian authorities. Cabinet-level awareness ensured that institutional response would include highest levels of federal government authority. As morning shift change occurred at Riverside Police Department, the convergence of military, federal, and community response systems was creating comprehensive accountability infrastructure that would transform Mitchell's abuse from potential administrative dismissal into unprecedented federal prosecution. The institutional power that civilian victims typically couldn't access was mobilizing on behalf of military officer whose service and rank ensured resources for accountability that should have been available to all citizens, regardless of military status. But the systematic response also revealed how ordinary victims of police abuse faced abandoned rather than supported by institutions designed to protect constitutional rights that Mitchell's military position was finally activating. General Marcus Thompson personally drove to Riverside Police Department at 8 a.m. after learning that Colonel Mitchell had been detained overnight without required military notification, his command authority and visible anger immediately transforming the institutional response. Thompson entered police headquarters in full dress uniform, with multiple stars clearly visible, his general officer authority commanding immediate attention from personnel unprepared for senior military leadership demanding accountability for abuse of subordinate officer. "I'm General Marcus Thompson, Fort Davidson commanding officer," he announced with unmistakable command presence. "I'm here regarding the illegal detention of Colonel Simone Mitchell, U.S. Army, who was held overnight, without proper military notification in violation of Department of Defense agreements with civilian law enforcement. His military authority established federal jurisdiction and institutional power that local police couldn't dismiss through typical administrative procedures." Police Chief Armstrong emerged from his office, immediately recognizing serious institutional crisis. "General Thompson, I wasn't aware we had military officer in detention. Let me review the overnight arrest records immediately." Thompson's response was definitive. "Chief Armstrong, the failure to notify military authorities about detained active duty colonel represents systematic violation of established protocols. I'm here to ensure Colonel Mitchell's immediate release and to coordinate with federal authorities investigating civil rights violations." The explicit reference to federal investigation made clear that military response included comprehensive accountability beyond administrative correction. Lieutenant Foster provided custody information while recognizing serious problems. "General Thompson, Colonel Mitchell was detained last night on DUI charges. She's been cooperative throughout detention." Thompson demanded immediate access. "Take me to Colonel Mitchell immediately. Any delay in releasing her to military custody will be documented as obstruction of federal military operations." His command authority left no room for bureaucratic delays or procedural obstruction that might have protected abusive officers. Mitchell was brought from detention cell, her completely shaved head immediately visible and shocking to everyone who understood the degrading nature of the abuse she had experienced. Colonel Mitchell, "I'm here," Thompson stated with combination of command authority and personal concern. "You're being released to military custody immediately. Military police and federal authorities are coordinating comprehensive response to your abuse." Mitchell maintained military bearing despite obvious trauma and degradation. "Sir, 4 officers forcibly shaved my head while I was restrained in detention. The assault was premeditated, racially motivated, and designed to degrade my military service and identity." Her clear statement provided command testimony that Thompson's authority would ensure received appropriate institutional response. Thompson's fury was visible but controlled. "Chief Armstrong, I want the officers responsible for this assault identified immediately. Colonel Mitchell is decorated combat veteran whose service includes 3 deployments and multiple commendations. This degrading abuse constitutes federal civil rights violations that will be prosecuted to the fullest extent." The explicit connection between Mitchell's distinguished service and the systematic abuse emphasized both personal injustice and institutional violation. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived with military police authority. "General Thompson, I have federal arrest warrants for civilians who assaulted military personnel. JAG coordination with DOJ has established federal jurisdiction for immediate prosecution. The military legal framework ensured rapid accountability that civilian complaints typically couldn't access through standard procedures." Federal prosecutor Patricia Young entered with FBI agents. "Chief Armstrong, the Department of Justice is taking custody of all evidence related to assault on Colonel Mitchell. Officers Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Sergeant Shaw are being arrested on federal civil rights charges." The federal prosecution demonstrated comprehensive institutional response mobilized by Mitchell's military position and the systematic nature of the abuse. Brennan attempted to justify the abuse when confronted. "General Thompson, the detainee was non-compliant and required physical intervention to establish security. Standard detention procedures were followed. Thompson's response was devastating. Officer Brennan, you assaulted a U.S. Army colonel by forcibly shaving her head while she was restrained. Detention cameras recorded your premeditated abuse and your explicit statements about teaching her respect. You will face federal prosecution for civil rights violations, assault and hate crimes. The comprehensive federal charges demonstrated that military and federal authority would ensure accountability exceeding typical administrative discipline." Mitchell provided formal statement documenting systematic abuse. "Officers Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Sergeant Shaw physically restrained me and forcibly shaved my head while I verbally protested and asserted my military status and constitutional rights. Their actions were premeditated, degradation, motivated by racial bias and hostility toward my military service. Her intelligence officer precision in documenting violations ensured comprehensive evidence for federal prosecution, as federal agents arrested the 4 officers while military police secured Mitchell for immediate medical and psychological evaluation. The transformation was complete. The officers who had confidently degraded detained colonel expecting institutional protection now faced federal prosecution. Mobilized by military institutional power and federal civil rights enforcement, Thompson ensured Mitchell's immediate care. "Colonel Mitchell, you're going to Fort Davidson Medical Facility for comprehensive evaluation. Military and federal resources are ensuring you receive all necessary support while we pursue maximum accountability." The institutional protection demonstrated how military status provided resources that civilian victims typically couldn't access despite equal constitutional rights. Riverside Police Department became the epicenter of unprecedented federal and military Intervention as Colonel Simone Mitchell's true identity and distinguished service record transformed systematic police abuse into national scandal, requiring accountability at the highest levels. Within hours of Mitchell's release to military custody, her complete service record was presented to media and federal authorities. The documentation revealing the extraordinary officer whom Riverside Police had degraded through racially motivated assault. Colonel Simone Mitchell, U.S. Army, 23 years of service, 3 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, Bronze Star for valor under fire, Purple Heart for wounds received in action, Defense Meritorious Service Medal, Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device, numerous other decorations recognizing exceptional leadership and intelligence work. Her military record demonstrated service at the highest levels of professional excellence, making the degrading abuse not only illegal but profoundly offensive to military values and national gratitude owed to combat veterans. General Thompson convened press conference at Fort Davidson, highlighting both Mitchell's service and the systematic abuse she had experienced. Colonel Mitchell is one of our most distinguished officers whose intelligence work has saved American lives. The degrading assault she experienced represents both civil rights violation and attack on military service itself. The military institutional response elevated the case beyond individual criminal prosecution to examination of how civilian law enforcement treated service members who deserved protection rather than abuse. Media coverage displayed side-by-side images. Mitchell in dress uniform with her military decorations and natural locks representing professional excellence, contrasted with booking photos showing her forcibly shaved head, revealing degrading abuse. Decorated Army colonel assaulted by police who shaved her head in detention, national headlines declared. Combat veteran subjected to degrading abuse by officers unaware of her military service and constitutional rights. The visual documentation created powerful public accountability that administrative procedures alone could never provide. Department of Defense Secretary issued formal statement. The assault on Colonel Mitchell represents unacceptable abuse of military personnel by civilian authorities. Federal prosecution will proceed with full support of Department of Defense, ensuring comprehensive accountability. Cabinet-level attention demonstrated that Mitchell's abuse had become matter of national concern, requiring highest levels of federal response. Congressional Armed Services Committee announced immediate hearings. Systematic abuse of decorated military officer raises questions about protection of service members and civil-military coordination, requiring legislative oversight. Political accountability complemented judicial prosecution while ensuring systematic reform beyond individual criminal cases. Officer Brennan's defense attorney attempted to minimize the abuse during federal arraignment. My client was following standard detention procedures for non-compliant individual. He had no knowledge of her military status and couldn't have anticipated her rank or service record. Federal prosecutor Young demolished the defense. The defendant forcibly shaved Colonel Mitchell's head while she repeatedly identified herself as Army officer and protested the assault. Video evidence shows premeditated degradation motivated by racial bias, not legitimate security concerns. The federal prosecution made clear that ignorance of military status didn't excuse systematic civil rights violations and assault. Mitchell addressed military gathering at Fort Davidson, her shaved head visible reminder of abuse, while her military bearing demonstrated resilience. I've served my country through 3 combat deployments and faced enemy fire multiple times. I never expected to experience systematic degradation from American law enforcement in my own community. Her testimony combined personal trauma with institutional critique that elevated the case beyond individual victimization. Military and veteran Organizations mobilized national response. Assault on Colonel Mitchell represents attack on all service members. We demand maximum federal accountability and systematic reform of civilian law enforcement treatment of military personnel. Organizational advocacy ensured sustained pressure beyond initial media attention cycle. Video footage of the actual assault was released through court proceedings. The images of 4 officers restraining and forcibly shaving Mitchell while she verbally protested, creating visceral public outrage that abstract legal arguments couldn't match. This is what they did to decorated combat veteran, viral social media posts declared. Colonel Mitchell served her country with honor and was degraded by police who saw only her race. Public documentation ensured comprehensive accountability that institutional protection historically prevented. Federal charges expanded as investigation revealed systematic patterns. Officers Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Sergeant Shaw face additional charges including conspiracy to violate civil rights, hate crimes, and obstruction of justice for attempting to destroy evidence of the assault. The comprehensive federal prosecution addressed both individual abuse and institutional conspiracy. Judge Victoria Williams, presiding over federal criminal case, denied bail for all defendants. The systematic degradation of military officer demonstrates danger requiring pre-trial detention. Defendants' abuse of authority while in positions of public trust creates substantial risk. Judicial recognition of serious threat ensured defendants couldn't continue threatening others while awaiting trial. General Thompson announced military honor ceremony recognizing Mitchell's service. Colonel Mitchell's distinguished career deserves recognition that civilian abuse attempted to diminish. Military community stands with her while demanding accountability. As comprehensive federal response mobilized military institutional power, civil rights enforcement, and public outrage, the transformation was complete. The officers who had confidently degraded detained woman, expecting institutional protection, now faced federal prosecution, national condemnation, and certain conviction based on video evidence they had created through their own systematic abuse. Most importantly, Mitchell's military position had catalyzed accountability that should have been available to all victims of police abuse, regardless of service record or professional status. Within 2 weeks of Colonel Mitchell's assault, comprehensive federal prosecution and military institutional response transformed police abuse from potential administrative dismissal into landmark civil rights case, establishing new standards for accountability. Department of Justice announced historic federal charges with unusual public detail. Officers Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Sergeant Shaw face federal prosecution for conspiracy to violate civil rights, assault of military personnel, deprivation of rights under color of law, and hate crimes. The premeditated degradation of Colonel Mitchell represents egregious abuse of authority requiring maximum federal accountability. The comprehensive charges ensured prosecution addressed both individual violence and institutional conspiracy, enabling systematic abuse. Federal trial proceeded with unprecedented speed, given strength of video evidence and witness testimony. The jury deliberating only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 4 defendants. Evidence of premeditated assault on military officer was overwhelming, jury foreman stated. The video documentation and defendants' own statements proved systematic abuse motivated by racial bias and hostility toward Colonel Mitchell's military service. Officer Brennan received 25-year federal prison sentence. Your leadership in forcibly shaving Colonel Mitchell's head while she was restrained represents particularly egregious abuse of authority. Maximum sentence is necessary to deter similar misconduct and acknowledge the severity of your civil rights violations. Officers Fisher and Wallace each received 18-year sentences. Your participation in systematic degradation of military officer demonstrates moral failure, requiring substantial federal punishment. Sergeant Shaw received 15 years for supervisory failure and obstruction. Your presence during assault without intervention, combined with subsequent false statements, constitutes serious violation of supervisory responsibility, requiring lengthy incarceration. The substantial federal sentences established precedent that degrading abuse of detained individuals carried serious criminal consequences beyond administrative discipline. Civil rights settlement included $12.8 million compensatory damages plus comprehensive police reform agreement. Financial compensation addresses Colonel Mitchell's suffering, but systematic reform prevents future abuse. Police Chief Armstrong was terminated for inadequate supervision, enabling years of misconduct. Chief Armstrong's leadership allowed systematic abuse through institutional tolerance and protection of violent officers. Riverside Police Department was placed under federal consent decree requiring comprehensive reform, independent civilian oversight with investigatory authority, mandatory bias training, revised detention procedures prohibiting degrading treatment, and body camera requirements, preventing evidence destruction. Federal oversight continues until Riverside PD demonstrates sustained constitutional compliance, protecting detained individuals from abuse, DOJ announced. Department of Defense issued new protocols for military-civilian law enforcement coordination. Active duty personnel detained by civilian authorities trigger mandatory military notification within 2 hours and oversight ensuring proper treatment of service members. The institutional reforms ensured systematic protection beyond individual case resolution. Colonel Mitchell received military recognition ceremony where General Thompson presented additional commendation. Colonel Mitchell's distinguished service deserves recognition that civilian abuse attempted to diminish. Her courage in pursuing accountability while processing personal trauma exemplifies the values defining military service. Military community support provided healing context while validating that her service was valued despite the degrading abuse. Congressional Armed Services Committee held hearings examining protection of military personnel, with Mitchell providing powerful testimony. I served my country through combat deployments and never expected to face systematic degradation from American law enforcement. Every service member deserves protection from abuse, regardless of rank or recognition. Legislative attention elevated military-civilian coordination to national priority, requiring ongoing oversight. National Police Accountability Coalition recognized Mitchell's case as catalyst for reform. Colonel Mitchell's assault exposed systematic problems, requiring comprehensive response. Her courage pursuing accountability has protected countless future victims. Advocacy organizations ensured sustained pressure beyond initial prosecution and settlement. Mitchell's hair began regrowing, the physical healing representing recovery. While acknowledging ongoing psychological trauma, my hair will grow back, but the violation of being forcibly degraded doesn't disappear. Accountability helps healing, but trauma persists. Her honest acknowledgement of ongoing impact validated experiences of abuse victims, while demonstrating that legal victory didn't eliminate psychological consequences. Military support programs provided comprehensive counseling addressing trauma. Colonel Mitchell's experience represents both individual abuse and institutional betrayal, requiring specialized treatment for service members facing civilian violence. Veteran organizations established Legal Defense Fund, supporting service members facing civilian law enforcement abuse. Colonel Mitchell's resources enabled comprehensive accountability. Other service members deserve similar protection regardless of rank or financial capacity. educational programs incorporated Mitchell's case into military-civilian relations training. This case demonstrates both need for proper coordination and consequences when civilian authorities abuse service members. Data analysis, 18 months. After the assault, showed measurable impact. Detention abuse complaints in Riverside decreased 87%. Civilian oversight documented improved constitutional compliance, and national awareness of service member protection increased. Significantly, numbers represent individual lives protected and institutional culture transformed, federal monitors reported. Mitchell returned to full military duty despite trauma, her resilience inspiring others. "I refuse to let abuse define my service or diminish my career." Accountability enables continued service without abandoning standards I've always maintained. The accountability process demonstrated that comprehensive response to police abuse required criminal prosecution, civil liability, institutional reform, military advocacy, and sustained oversight, ensuring cultural transformation rather than temporary administrative correction. Over the following 36 months, the transformation catalyzed by Colonel Mitchell's assault evolved from Riverside-specific reforms into national movement addressing systematic police detention abuse that had affected vulnerable populations. While institutional tolerance prevented adequate accountability, the Military Personnel Protection Act, inspired directly by Mitchell's case, established federal standards for civilian law enforcement treatment of service members, mandatory military notification within 2 hours of detention, oversight ensuring proper treatment, prohibition on degrading punishment, and federal prosecution authority for systematic abuse. Colonel Mitchell's assault demonstrated need for federal protection when local accountability fails, congressional sponsors explained during legislative debate. Service members deserve constitutional protection from civilian authorities who abuse detention authority. The legislative framework ensured federal resources supported military personnel facing civilian law enforcement abuse. Department of Defense implemented comprehensive coordination protocols. All civilian law enforcement agencies detaining active duty personnel must follow standardized procedures, ensuring proper treatment and military oversight. Military institutional reforms protected service members while establishing accountability when civilian authorities violated established protocols. Mitchell became national advocate for detention reform while continuing military service. My assault exposed systematic problems affecting not just service members, but all detained individuals who face abuse from those wielding unchecked authority. Her advocacy emphasized that reform must serve universal protection rather than privileged military status. National detention standards prohibited degrading treatment, including forced alteration of appearance, the Mitchell Rule specifically, protecting natural hairstyles from discriminatory enforcement. Forcibly shaving detained individuals' hair constitutes degrading punishment, violating constitutional protections against cruel treatment. The specific prohibition addressed both Mitchell's experience and historical patterns of using forced grooming as tool of degradation and racial control in detention settings. Independent civilian oversight boards with investigatory authority were established nationwide, their membership including formerly detained individuals whose experiences informed accountability priorities. Oversight by those who experienced detention ensures policies address actual rather than theoretical problems. Community power in accountability prevented administrative self-protection that had historically enabled abuse. Mandatory video documentation of all detention interactions became federal standard, with severe penalties for camera deactivation or evidence destruction. Video evidence was crucial for prosecuting Colonel Mitchell's abusers. Comprehensive documentation protects both detained individuals and officers from false claims. Technology requirements ensured that abuse would be documented rather than occurring in unmonitored spaces where institutional protection had historically prevented accountability. Cultural competency training, specifically addressing natural black hairstyles and protection from discriminatory grooming enforcement, became mandatory. Previous standards reflected Eurocentric assumptions, treating natural black hair as unprofessional or threatening. Training addresses bias, enabling discriminatory treatment. Educational reform challenged underlying prejudices that had motivated Mitchell's assault and affected countless others facing similar bias. Military-civilian law enforcement liaison programs improved coordination while educating officers about proper treatment of service members. Understanding military culture and proper protocols prevents abuse while ensuring appropriate coordination when service members are detained. Professional education addressed both procedural requirements and cultural respect, preventing degrading treatment. Psychological support programs for detention abuse survivors expanded to address trauma from degrading treatment. Colonel Mitchell's assault caused both physical harm and psychological trauma, requiring specialized treatment, addressing violation by authority figures. Therapeutic resources acknowledged that degrading abuse created lasting impact, requiring comprehensive support beyond legal remedies. Legal reforms eliminated qualified immunity for detention personnel who engaged in degrading treatment. Officers who forcibly shave detained individuals' hair or engage in similar degrading abuse face personal civil liability, ensuring individual accountability. Financial consequences complemented criminal prosecution in creating comprehensive deterrence. Restorative justice programs brought together abuse survivors and reformed detention personnel. Dialogue allows healing while educating officers about human impact of abuse they may have normalized through institutional culture. Alternative accountability approaches addressed both individual harm and cultural transformation. Academic research documented systematic patterns validating community experiences. Data confirms that degrading treatment in detention disproportionately affects minority individuals, particularly black women, whose natural hair is targeted through discriminatory enforcement. Evidence-based analysis provided foundation for policy reform, addressing documented rather than assumed problems. International human rights organizations recognized American detention reform as addressing problems affecting many nations. Colonel Mitchell's case catalyzed transformation, showing that protecting human dignity during detention serves both individual rights and institutional legitimacy. Global attention elevated detention abuse from local concern to universal human rights issue requiring international standards. Mitchell's military career continued with promotion to Brigadier General. Colonel Mitchell's distinguished service and advocacy for justice demonstrate leadership deserving recognition through advancement to general officer rank. Professional success despite trauma validated that abuse didn't diminish her capabilities while inspiring others facing similar challenges. Her natural hair regrew into locks she maintained proudly. "My hair represents both cultural identity and recovery from abuse. Wearing it naturally and professionally demonstrates that neither military service nor civilian abuse diminishes my authentic self." Personal reclamation of identity represented healing while challenging continued bias against natural black hairstyles in professional contexts. 3 years after the assault, comprehensive data demonstrated measurable transformation. Detention abuse complaints decreased 79% nationally, Forced grooming incidents became virtually non-existent in monitored facilities, and institutional culture shifted from tolerance to prevention of degrading treatment. Numbers represent individual lives protected and institutional culture transformed, federal monitors reported. But sustained reform requires ongoing commitment beyond initial policy changes. Military community support for Mitchell remained strong. General Mitchell's courage pursuing accountability while continuing distinguished service inspires all of us to demand both excellence and justice. Veteran organizations established the Mitchell Standard for treatment of detained service members. Every military personnel deserves protection from abuse. General Mitchell's experience must never be repeated. National Police Accountability. Coalition recognized Mitchell's advocacy. General Mitchell transformed personal trauma into systematic reform, protecting vulnerable populations from degrading abuse by those wielding authority. Educational institutions incorporated her case into civil rights curriculum. The Mitchell case demonstrates how individual courage combined with institutional accountability can catalyze comprehensive reform, addressing systematic problems. Mitchell addressed military academy graduates about leadership and justice. Military service requires defending Constitution and human dignity. That obligation doesn't end at our borders. It requires confronting abuse wherever authority is misused, including by civilian authorities who violate rights we're sworn to protect. The systematic reforms demonstrated that comprehensive transformation required criminal prosecution, civil liability, legislative action, community oversight, cultural education, and sustained monitoring, ensuring that detention practices protected, rather than violated human dignity and constitutional rights. 5 years after officers forcibly shaved her head in Riverside Police Department detention, Brigadier General Simone Mitchell stood before the National Law Enforcement and Military Coordination Conference, her natural locks grown back and worn, with pride representing both personal healing and cultural transformation. 5 years ago, I was forcibly held down and had my head shaved by officers who saw only my race, not my service or my humanity. Mitchell addressed 3,000 law enforcement and military personnel. That degrading assault could have destroyed me, but instead it catalyzed transformation, protecting countless others from similar abuse. Her testimony combined personal vulnerability with institutional analysis that elevated individual trauma to systematic reform, catalyzing national change. General Marcus Thompson, who had initiated the federal response that ensured accountability, reflected on institutional transformation. General Mitchell's assault exposed failures in military-civilian coordination and systematic detention abuse. Her courage, pursuing accountability while continuing distinguished service, demonstrates the leadership our military and our nation require. His military perspective validated that justice served rather than conflicted with continued service excellence. Statistical evidence demonstrated measurable national impact. Detention abuse incidents had decreased 81%. Forced grooming of detained individuals had virtually disappeared from monitored facilities, and military-civilian coordination had improved significantly through standardized protocols protecting service members. Numbers represent individual lives protected and institutional culture transformed, researchers documented. But General Mitchell's greatest legacy is cultural shift from tolerating to preventing degrading abuse by authority figures. Officers Brennan, Fisher, Wallace, and Shaw remained in federal prison serving lengthy sentences, their convictions establishing precedent that degrading abuse of detained individuals carried serious criminal consequences. These cases demonstrate that detention authority doesn't include degrading punishment violating constitutional protections and human dignity. The substantial sentences provided both justice and deterrence, preventing similar abuse. Riverside Police Department had been transformed under sustained federal oversight, its culture shift from aggressive enforcement to constitutional compliance. Serving as national model, comprehensive reform demonstrates that protecting detainee rights enhances rather than compromises legitimate law enforcement. Institutional transformation validated that accountability served rather than threatened effective policing. Mitchell's military career had flourished despite trauma. Her promotion to general officer, representing both personal achievement and institutional recognition that abuse didn't diminish her capabilities. General Mitchell's distinguished service proves that trauma survivors can continue excellence while pursuing justice and reform. Professional success validated that accountability and healing enabled rather than prevented continued contribution. Her daughter Jasmine had been inspired to pursue military JAG career. My mother's experience taught me that justice requires both legal expertise and moral courage. Military legal service allows me to protect service members facing similar challenges. Intergenerational impact demonstrated how individual trauma could inspire sustained commitment to institutional reform. Community oversight boards established through reform efforts provided ongoing accountability. Civilian oversight with investigatory authority ensures that detention practices remain constitutional and humane rather than reverting to previous abusive patterns. Sustained monitoring prevented backsliding toward practices that institutional culture had historically protected. Educational programs incorporating Mitchell's case reached hundreds of thousands of law enforcement and military personnel. This case teaches both proper protocols and human consequences when authority is abused through degrading treatment. Professional education ensured that lessons learned would influence institutional culture beyond those directly involved in reform. Mitchell's advocacy extended beyond military context to all detention reform. My service gave me resources for accountability that most abuse victims lack. True justice requires equal protection regardless of rank, recognition, or institutional position. Her universal approach emphasized that reform must serve all vulnerable populations rather than privileged few. National recognition included numerous awards, but Mitchell emphasized systematic change over individual honors. Awards acknowledge personal courage, but systematic reform protecting vulnerable populations represents true success. My assault mattered only if it prevented similar abuse of others. Restorative justice dialogue between Mitchell and reformed officers who had witnessed but not participated in the assault provided healing and education. Understanding human impact of institutional tolerance helps reformed personnel become advocates preventing abuse they once enabled through silence. Alternative accountability approaches addressed cultural transformation beyond punishment alone. Mitchell's mother, Grace, attended the conference with pride. My daughter served her country with honor and faced degrading abuse that could have broken her. Watching her transform trauma into justice for others represents the values I tried to instill. Family perspective acknowledged both personal pain and collective achievement. As Mitchell concluded her keynote address, the transformation was evident, degrading. Abuse that could have been dismissed through institutional protection had catalyzed national movement, addressing systematic detention practices affecting millions. Most importantly, her advocacy emphasized that reform must serve universal protection. Every detained individual deserves constitutional treatment and human dignity. My military rank enabled accountability, but justice requires protecting everyone, regardless of their service or status. The standing ovation acknowledged both her personal courage and the systematic transformation her experience had catalyzed. 5 years after experiencing degrading abuse designed to humiliate and dehumanize her, General Mitchell had transformed trauma into comprehensive reform, protecting constitutional rights and human dignity in detention settings nationwide. Her natural locks, worn with pride in military uniform that explicitly protected such hairstyles through regulations her advocacy had strengthened, represented both personal healing and cultural transformation, challenging bias that had motivated her assault. The decorated combat veteran who had been forcibly degraded by those who saw only her race had become general officer and national advocate, demonstrating that trauma survivors could pursue both personal excellence and collective justice. That transformation, from individual assault to national reform, from institutional tolerance to federal accountability, from degrading abuse to protective standards, represented the kind of change that made both military institutions and civilian law enforcement more just, more constitutional, and more faithful to principles requiring protection of human dignity regardless of circumstances or status. The officers who had confidently degraded detained women, expecting institutional protection, had instead catalyzed comprehensive transformation, ensuring that their abuse would be remembered not for its cruelty, but for the reform it inspired and the countless individuals it would protect from similar degradation. General Simone Mitchell's legacy would be measured not in military promotions or awards alone, but in the systematic protections ensuring that no detained individual would face degrading treatment by those entrusted with authority over vulnerable populations. Her journey from victim to advocate, from colonel to general, from trauma to transformation, demonstrated that justice required both individual courage and institutional accountability, and that one person's refusal to accept abuse could catalyze reform, protecting entire populations from systematic violations of constitutional rights and human dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.